study,
and play come together on a Windows 11 PC.
And for a limited time, college students get
The best of both worlds.
Get the Unreal College Deal. Everything you need to study and play with select Windows 11 PCs. Eligible students get a year of Microsoft 365 Premium and a year of Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with a custom color Xbox wireless controller. Learn more at windows.com/student offer. While supplies last. Ends June 30th. Terms at aka.ms/collegepc.
Marvel Television's Wonder Man, an 8-episode series, now streaming on Disney+.
A superhero remake, not exactly what we'd expect from an Oscar-winning director.
Action! Simon Williams, audition for Wonder Man.
I'm gonna need you to sign this, assuming you don't have superpowers.
I'll never work again if anyone found out.
My lips are sealed.
Marvel Television's Wonder Man. All 8 episodes now streaming, only on Disney+.
This episode is brought to you by Perfect Bistro Cat Food. Cats, this ad is for you. Has your human ever called you picky, persnickety, choosy? If so, Perfect Bistro Cat Food is for you. With ingredients like wild-caught tuna and pasture-raised lamb, tantalizing textures, and delectable flavors that meet even the most discerning cat standards. You're not picky, you're just perfectionists. Perfect Bistro, mealtime perfection for every cat. Have your human visit perfectbistro.com.
So our estimates of case fatality rates for bubonic plague is around 60%. So that's you're not treated. What are your chances of survival? You're probably, and if you're going to die, you're probably going to die within 4 to 6 days of starting to exhibit symptoms. But the other two forms are faster acting and they are more deadly. And the worst of them all is pneumonic plague, which is the form if the disease goes aerosol. So if you're around someone who coughs and aerosol parts of that bacteria then into your body through your mouth straight into your lungs, you can die within 24 hours, certainly within 48 hours. And the case fatality rate for that is 99%.
Drink? Now, shall we begin?
Hello. In 1347, Genoese merchants were holed up in Kaffa, in the Crimean Peninsula, as Mongols and Turks besieged the city. The invading army of Khan Janibeg had been resisted for 2 years, and so surely an end was in sight, especially as disease had ripped through the besiegers. But in a final throw of the dice, the great king, using engines of war, hurled dead bodies, swollen from sickness and blackened with corruption, into Kaffa. A terrible plague ripped through the populace within, and the Genoese decided to leave by ship. They escaped, but so did the bacteria, and it would spread throughout the medieval world, killing 100 million. Joining today is Thomas Asbridge, author of The Black Death, A Global History, as he discusses the terrible pestilence that had massive ramifications, and which still kills today. Coming up, I've got plenty more history on the way, and bonus episodes, including the defence crisis in Britain today. So please do rate and review, and if you can share with friends or family, that would be fantastic. But let's go into the club with Thomas Asbridge. Thomas, a great pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you very much for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
Well, it's been my pleasure to read your book, actually, about the Black Death, which is, I have to admit, is the first book I've read about the Black Death. Obviously, knowing the subject, I guess I would have studied it at primary school, probably. But I guess the subtitle is A Global History, which is an important difference to the other accounts that have been written about the Black Death. And I guess I wanted to ask you about that firstly, really, because, I seem to vaguely recall, in more recent, my reading into the Black Death, that it sort of comes from the East, and there's this sort of, that adds a sort of, I guess at the time, a supposed slight sinister addition to the already quite frightening disease that was spreading through Europe.
Yeah, I mean, this idea of the global perspective was really one of the key objectives of the book. And exactly as you say, I think most of us, in one way or another, are exposed to the Black Death through our education, depending on no matter what age you might be when you come across it in study. And very often it's taught primarily as a British phenomenon. I've met plenty of people over the years that I've been working on this book who are surprised to even hear it's outside Britain, let alone beyond the boundaries of Europe. And because of the other kind of work that I've done during my career, I spent a lot of my time working on things like the Crusades, contact between the European world and the Muslim world. I started to become aware of the fact that that Islam was profoundly influenced and affected by and damaged by the Black Death, and started to think about the idea of doing a comparative study and broadening the lens. And I guess it's slightly trite to say this, but the honest truth is it's the absolute bottom line reality of how I thought about this book project. I thought about it in terms of Google Maps. So my objective really was to take the really global view, to pan out as much as I could and think about how different regions and localities and realms were affected, and to compare and contrast them. Because one of the things that became very apparent very quickly was that the Black Death was not the same everywhere. There was a variety of experience. But the other thing I really wanted to do was to perform the other trick that the Google Maps can do, and that's zoom right into a particular settlement, or even beyond that, right into a particular household, and to look at the human dimension of this pandemic. And when I worked through the current historiography, so what was published to date in the field, I found what I thought was a really important gap in both of those areas, both from a global perspective and something that really focused on the human experience. And that's the way I tried to design the book.
Well, yes, that human element, though, that I've found increasingly more fascinating beyond the sort of vast numbers that can be quite sort of overawing. I think, I guess it's difficult to know exactly how many, but 100 million or something. But for the people who went through it, I find that almost the most horrifically fascinating part of the story, in that these are people who lost. Those who survived presumably would have been sort of the mental torment, the trauma that they would have experienced, and how they dealt with that. I mean, it's mind-boggling, really.
Yeah, and that's one of the issues that I tried to address in the book. I'll warn any prospective readers that the final chapter, chapter 11 of the book, before the conclusion, has what I think is an accurate title, but it might not sound like the cheeriest of titles. So people might think, oh, maybe I should avoid that chapter. It's called The Culture of Death, which is maybe not going to bring everyone to read it, but it is.
I think it will, actually. I think that, that
we'll
does
see,
become
but
attractive.
It asks exactly that question. What happens to a society at a psychological and emotional level when they face this kind of loss? And exactly as you said, one of the things I wanted to do was to take our understanding of this event away from just a statistical level. I mean, we're nearly 700 years divorced from this event, so I'm not expecting every single person who reads the book to shed tears for those who are lost. But it mattered to me to name them, to remember them, to in some way to memorialize what happened during this first outbreak of plague and the subsequent reoccurrences of the disease, because I think it was a truly shattering experience.
Well, plague has afflicted humanity, I mean, throughout history. I remember studying ancient history, and there's a big plague in Athens during the Peloponnesian War. Is it a sort of, and I have to confess, I haven't got to the bit where it's solved. We know what it is, but is it related, the plague itself, how did it evolve from ancient Athens, which is probably the first most famous incident of a plague?
Yeah, so that's the plague of Athens is known historically as the plague of Athens, but we don't think it was actually plague.
Right.
So let's backtrack just a tiny bit.
Sure.
Because you've raised the question, what was the Black Death? And one of the things that I wrestle with in the book is that identification, technically what we would call the causative agent. But in simple terms, what disease is it? Is it a virus? Is it some form of bacteria? And how does it manifest itself? And do we know it today? And for a long time, we thought we knew the answer very clearly and very clinically, because an extraordinary scientist, Swiss-French Louis Pasteur trained scientist called Alexander Yersin, showing extraordinary bravery, went into Hong Kong in 1894 during a major outbreak of a terrible lethal disease, and was the first person to see this germ under a microscope that we now call Yersinia pestis, named after him, named in his honor, and determined on the basis of that we were dealing with what he called bubonic plague, although the disease can also manifest itself in a couple of other forms, septicemic and pneumonic forms. And right from the start, even when he published his findings in 1894, he made a connection with what had happened historically and with the Black Death. And up until about the 1950s, that was done and dusted. People thought they understood everything about the Black Death, including how the disease was transmitted. But there were, by the time we get to the 1970s, and particularly from the 1980s onwards, people start to raise some slightly uncomfortable questions about why there were differences between the modern appearance of plague and what was happening in the Black Death. And the biggest difference is lethality, how deadly this disease was. The modern plague, I should say, could certainly kill millions. It killed an estimated 25 million in India, but that took decades. Whereas the Black Death, as you mentioned earlier on, we cannot get a precise figure. My estimate, and I'd stress it very much as an estimate, is about 100 million people over the course of 1347 to 1353 across all of the medieval world. But these are differences of speed and magnitude in terms of its lethality. So these questions were asked, and I think it's quite right that they were asked, and a very vituperative argument basically sprang up amongst different academics, scholars, scientists, historians, and archaeologists, trying to determine what was the Black Death. And alternatives were raised. Was it something akin to Ebola, some kind of hemorrhagic virus? Was it anthrax? That was the suggestion by one British academic. And the answer was really only reached definitively in 2011, because by that point we had the genetic code of modern plague, of modern Yersinia pestis. So we had something we could compare with historical findings. And the critical piece of the puzzle was that we were able to go to London, where they had excavated a major emergency burial ground created during the Black Death in 1349. And they still had those skeletons. And the key is that that burial ground at that level was never reused. So we knew for sure that if you test those skeletons, they come from the Black Death. They don't come from anywhere else. And in 2011, in the really prestigious scientific journal Nature, the article was published demonstrating that they had found traces of Yersinia pestis in those skeletons. So that the answer was there. It was plague after all. That said, I'll really put my cards on the table. And of course, I'm not a scientist. I'm trained as a medieval historian. But one of the great pleasures of working on this project has been immersing myself in the scientific literature, but also appreciating how this is a live topic. This is a subject that continues to change, continues to evolve in our understanding. Literally 2 days ago, from us speaking now, it was announced that they've now found, at this stage at least, the oldest evidence of Yersinia pestis. We can now date it 5,500 years ago as the earliest finding of this same bacteria, though it has evolved over time, and the version that appeared during the Black Death appears to be the most deadly and the most virulent in comparison to earlier outbreaks. But that's one of the things that makes the subject, to me, so exciting, that it has fresh horizons coming.
I had a real thrill reading about the excavations at Smithfield, because Thomas, I was an archaeologist at Spitalfields in 1999 when we excavated a large number of skeletons that had the bodies of which had died from the plague. So it was a real thrill reading that little part of the book. But I think the science element, I was going to ask you this because, as you say, you're not a scientist, but you've obviously know your stuff. I mean, for me, the idea of science at school was a horror. I avoided it as much as I could. But the way you've written it, yeah. But the way you've written it, I wonder if it takes a non-scientist to write science in a history book. I think.
I don't
Because
know.
I
Time will
guess what I'm
tell.
getting at is that you've explained it very clearly. It's fascinatingly disgusting reading about
Yeah,
this.
I've tried to write it in a way that I could have understood it before I
Yeah.
really dedicated 8 or 9 years of my life to understanding the Black Death. So I hope that comes across. There's always an issue with precision of language. So I got some help from a scientist at the Institut Pasteur in Paris who read through a section because I was reflecting some of his own scholarship on modern plague. Because the other element of understanding plague, it's still around as a disease. So there's still outbreaks. There was a very significant outbreak in Madagascar in 2017 that actually has changed our understanding because it showed that human to human transmission was not just possible, but very significant. But it's
And in
also,
America as well. Sorry, Thomas, to
yeah,
interrupt.
yeah,
Amazing.
yeah. I was in America in 2019 and traveling to Yosemite with my family, and I was absolutely delighted to see that I was for the first time in my life in a plague-affected area. There were big signs up saying "Beware plague," because when the plague broke out again in Asia at the end of the 19th century, and as I said, appeared in Hong Kong. From that point onwards, things like steamships and trains started to transport it across the globe. It popped up in all over South America, North America, Australasia, and Europe. There were outbreaks in Glasgow, in Liverpool, and in California, it became endemic. So that's why it's in the USA.
Amazing. It really is. I wondered about how influential the Black Death has been culturally, actually, because I mean, there I I couldn't help thinking about sort of these silly Hollywood films, which I find quite enjoyable, like World War Z or something. But I wondered if there's that kind of element of this sort of lethal infection that is, I mean, very high fatality rates. This is something that is terribly scary, and I just wondered if you think the Black Death is kind of one of the other impacts it's had is on us culturally.
Yeah, I think it's left a mark on our collective memories as an event that in many ways is unparalleled. Obviously, we've got what popularly is known as the Spanish flu from the early part of the 20th century, which was very, very widespread, very lethal. But in terms of proportion of the population and overall lasting impact, I think the Black Death is even more significant. And there's an element to that which we haven't quite explained yet, which I think is worth specifying. And that is the majority of the book that I've written is focused on the first outbreak of the disease in the mid part of the 14th century, as I said, 1347 to 53. But if the disease had been a one and done, if that had been the only appearance, it would still have been incredibly destructive and significant. But its overall ability to affect the course of history would, I think, have been significantly attenuated, because remarkably, the medieval world showed itself to be incredibly capable of showing resilience, endurance, and adaptability. But the terrible and tragic fact was the disease was not finished. If you were someone who was alive in 1355, 1356, and you were perhaps patting yourself on the back thinking, well, I made it through that apocalyptic event. How grateful I am. What you didn't know is that the disease was going to come back in 1361 to 3 and kill another 20% of the population. And it was going to keep coming back every 10 to 15 years for centuries. Most places it lasted at least 3 centuries, some places even beyond that. So it becomes a fact of life. And that's one of the things that I call that era in the book, the age of plague. And really, I only trace it up to around the year 1500, or in some places up to 1517. But this is an event, a disease that really is world changing because of that fact that it makes this enormous first impression, this first calamitous effect, and then it reoccurs.
And I wanted to get onto the impact here in Britain, but of course it's global, as you write about, and I wondered about the differences that I guess each region experienced and who they attempted to blame, because I mean that's a factor that we see. I mean, of course, blame's the right word for some, but in others, what's the cause as well? What's the reason?
Yeah, obviously, one of the lessons I think we should take from the Black Death is being aware of the fact that almost regardless of what the crisis is, human societies often look for scapegoats and obviously look for explanations. I guess at one level, not surprisingly, the majority of the medieval world takes a religious view of what's happened. So whether you're a Christian, a Jew, or a Muslim in this era, you see the plague, you see the Black Death as an act of God. But there is a very significant difference in the Muslim world because, for example, in Christendom, it's regarded as an act of God that is a form of punishment for humanity's sin, a fairly traditional medieval perspective. But in the Muslim world, there is a very, very different interpretation. And this goes back to the fact that plague had been present in the Near Middle East and North Africa and Saudi Arabia at the time when Muhammad had first appeared and Islam was first born in the 7th century. So there's early Islamic theology and beliefs and ideals about how the Muslim world should interpret and respond to plague. And the difference is they say it's an act of God, but they say for devout Muslims, it's not a punishment, it's a gift. Because if you get plague and you die from plague, you are actually a martyr. You're guaranteed a place in heaven, almost akin to as if you had been fighting a holy war. And on that basis, Islamic theology argues or presents two really important rules of behavior. One is that you're not allowed to flee from a plague-infected area. And secondly, that the disease is not contagious. You don't catch the disease from another person. If you get it, it's the will of God. If you don't get it, that's also a divine sanction. And on that basis, it would appear that a significant proportion of the Muslim world, and particularly the area that I'm able to study most closely because of surviving records, the great superpower of the late Middle Ages, the Mamluk Empire, with its base primarily in Egypt and parts of the Near East and Syria, that world seems to have reacted very differently from Europe, where people do run away from plague-affected areas. People are very fearful and cautious around others who've caught the disease. But in the Muslim world, that type of behavior does not seem to occur in the same way. And that may well have led to significantly higher mortality rates in places like Cairo and Damascus.
And here in Britain, we know some of the consequences of the plague were positive for certain levels of society. But I suppose, were there accounts, was that something that people would have expressed or did express in writing?
To some extent.
I guess I'm getting at the economic results of a smaller workforce, and therefore...
Yeah, it's rarer that we get people celebrating the changes, because very often the people who are writing those kind of accounts, chronicles or narrative accounts, and sometimes letters from the nobility or even from the crown, what they're really complaining about is the fact that there's a new level of social mobility. And they complain for decades about the fact that who are these upstarts who want to wear fancier clothes and eat better food and get paid more? I mean, this is outrageous. One of the most depressing and in many ways insulting pieces of evidence is the letter that King Edward III writes towards the end of the summer and into the autumn of 1349, after the Black Death has ravaged the southern part of the English realm. And he writes this letter and distributes it to churchmen and asks for it to be broadcast to all the faithful. And essentially it says, who are you, ungrateful lot? You've been spared, and now all you're doing is complaining. Stop it. This is appalling. And they tried to introduce successive rafts of legislation to clamp down on increases in prices, to clamp down on changes and increases in wages. They put plenty of people in prison. Ultimately, they're not able to hold back the tide. And so there is a significant degree of increased social mobility. There is some improvement in the lot of lower class groups, particularly peasant farmers. It's not permanent. It's not all rosy, but as you suggested, not everyone loses from the Black Death. Sometimes I describe it as those who died, those who survived, and those who thrived. There are often at that level, we don't get their individual voices, but we can track their careers. There's this remarkable woman called Marjorie Brown or Brune, a citizen of London. And I find her a fascinating character. She went through quite a few husbands, is a polite way of putting it. So she'd already lost her husband before the Black Death arrived. Then she lost her husband during the Black Death and then remarried, but he died relatively soon thereafter. And we eventually get to see what her range of wealth is by the time she does her own will in the 1370s. And she has amassed a serious fortune and a serious array of goods and property. And she's benefited enormously. She's thrived in the aftermath of the Black Death, for sure.
Well, that's a kind of rather clear economic benefit, because quite literally the man who has the money has died and she left it to her. But I'm interested in the sort of, I guess we move from science to economic theory and stuff like that, because I mean, you say it was limited then, because close to a sort of, it's a free market in a way. It's a manipulated free market in a feudal system, I suppose. And the weight of numbers presumably would be impossible. Edward III can pass as much legislation as he likes, but it's not going to change the fact that there's a finite number of people working for it.
Yeah, ultimately, what we might now describe as market forces start to have their effect. Again, if we broaden our lens a little bit across the European world, we can see these same forces having an effect in France, having an effect in Italy and other areas, and they give rise to social unrest in England. We obviously start to think about the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, but there are similar uprisings in different parts of Christian Europe.
And in Islam?
But that's what I was going to say. The same is not true in
yeah.
the Mamluk world, because the Mamluk world is holding fast. And I think if you were a commentator at the end of the 14th century or through to the mid part of the 15th, you'd probably look at the Mamluks and say, wow, look how well they're doing. They're holding on to their regime. They're not having to make that many changes. Everything seems to be going well for them. But actually, they're not making the really painful adjustments that need to take place. And the seeds of their eventual ruination are being sowed because they're not adapting. The other thing that we need to say, because one of the reasons I said there's limitations, is plague is not the only game in town. So there's a much more complex system at work. And much as I love studying the Black Death and writing about the Black Death, I'm trying not to be the man who tells you Black Death is the cause of everything. So the reality is that there are at least two other factors at work, and one of them is perhaps the most important. It overtakes plague in terms of its significance, and that's naturally occurring climate change. Because since the mid part of the 13th century and accelerating into the 14th century, the world has been undergoing what we now call the Little Ice Age, or the start of the Little Ice Age, a gradual move to a cooling of around 0.4 to 0.8 degrees centigrade annually. And also associated with that, a much higher incidence of freak and extreme weather events. So the climate is becoming much less predictable. That in itself is perhaps responsible in the background for the Black Death actually making the jump from being a rodent-based disease to one that infects humans because of changes in rodent movements and human population movements. But it's also working in the background to destabilize the medieval world. And the other factor at work is, if you think about it, it's almost like a triangle. Sometimes I call it the unholy trinity of the age of plague. You've got plague, you've got climate change, and you've got an increasing tempo of endemic warfare because everyone's scrabbling for resources in this increasingly precarious world. So all three of those things combine to make the world a pretty difficult place to be. And if anyone listening is thinking about building a time machine and considering when they want to jump back to, my strong recommendation is, well, certainly don't go back to the time of the Black Death, the mid-14th century, but I probably would avoid the 14th and most of the 15th century altogether.
Well, that's it. You presumably, if you went back with a supply of penicillin, would you be all right?
Streptomycin. So it's a particular antibiotic that we've been using since the 1950s to defeat plague. So we are now able to treat cases of bubonic plague. As I said, there are two other forms. the, there's this, as always, there's debate about exact what we call case fatality rates. And they're difficult to judge because really what you're trying to judge is how likely is someone to die if they're untreated. And interestingly, one of the reasons we know as much about plague as we do is because, which I had no idea about, there was a lot of plague during the Vietnam War in the 1960s and 70s. So one of the most authoritative texts is written by an American physician who treated lots of American soldiers with plague. So our estimates of case fatality rates for bubonic plague is around 60%. So that's, you're not treated. What are your chances of survival? You're probably, and if you're going to die, you're probably going to die within 4 to 6 days of starting to exhibit symptoms. But the other two forms are faster acting and they are more deadly. And the worst of them all is pneumonic plague, which is the form if the disease goes aerosol. So if you're around someone who coughs and aerosol parts of that bacteria then into your body through your mouth straight into your lungs, you can die within 24 hours, certainly within 48 hours. And the case fatality rate for that is 99%, at least 99%. So your chances of survival are pretty poor. If you're exposed in that way, you need to move very fast to get some kind of treatment.
Oh dear, right.
Which is all to say, you might be carrying your antibiotics, but that doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be safe.
Understood. Okay, I will not set the dial. I mean, that's the thing. I guess it was interesting, sort of various forms of treatment, because of course, if even modern medicine's going to struggle to deal with certain variants of the plague, I mean, how are rudimentary? I guess I call them physicians, but what really are they left to do? I mean, there was very little they could do.
Yeah, they turn to their established methods and forms of understanding. So one of the most prevalent, I guess you describe it as patterns of understanding of human health, is what we call the four humors or Galenic theory, the idea that there are various components in the body and that they need to be in balance if you're going to be healthy. And you think about ways of then affecting them, including bloodletting, so allowing certain amounts of blood out of a person's body to somehow rebalance their humors. We see those kind of treatments attempted. We see quite a lot of use of and recommended use of a particularly unusual and valuable medicine, something called theriac, which is a compound made up of lots of different ingredients, most of which would have had no effect whatsoever. But one of those ingredients is opium. So it would have had a pharmacological effect for someone, let's say, suffering from bubonic plague, in that it would have lessened their pain and it might have aided their breathing, but it's going to do nothing to stop them dying from the disease itself.
These symptoms are, I guess it's in your the nodes, your sort of glands in your
the lymph nodes. Yeah. So in the bubonic form, the typical pathology is that it enters the body often through an insect bite, and that it's then the body herds it towards the nearest lymph node. So if the bite is on the leg, it's going to be in the groin. If it's going to be on your arm, then it will be in your armpit. Other in parts of the body, it might be in your neck. Those are the classic locations that we see described actually incredibly accurately by some writers and some specialists during the Black Death, perhaps most notably in southern Spain, in Moorish Spain. There's a writer in Almeria called Ibn Khatama who's very precise in his records about the disease. But then once it gets to that lymph node, the bacteria starts to multiply, and if the body's not able to stop it in its tracks, ultimately it starts to produce a swelling, the classic thing that we call a bubo. That becomes hot to the touch, very, very painful. And ultimately, it starts to grow to such an extent that it bursts, and that unleashes a massive torrent of this pathogen through the body, and it can then kill either through septicemic shock, or if it reaches the lungs, then it starts to destroy lung tissue, and the victim starts to spit up blood and ultimately dies.
It's just awful. It really is. And that's where, some of these accounts that you write about are just, are kind of overwhelming in a way. They're just so awful. And the sheer number of people affected. It's just like something out of a horror film. It really is. It's
Yeah, I could not avoid, when researching and writing on this project, thinking about how we might react and the degree to which we would be able to cope with something similar. Because one of the things I try to do in the book, which I don't think other historians have really done enough to drive home a critical fact about this disease. For people in the mid 14th century, this was an unknown ailment. They had no idea what it was. They had no idea how it was transmitted. That was crucial, because was it through being close to someone else? Was it through what you ate? Some even suggested that you could literally just look someone in the eye and you could catch the Black Death. So that bred a really, really deep sense of fear. And even more importantly, they had no idea whether it was going to end. Was there going to be an end to this horror? And so that created a really febrile atmosphere. And I think if we confronted something similar to that, we've all lived through the COVID pandemic very recently. And I guess most of us can remember what it was like in those early weeks and months, especially on things like transmission. There was so little known. How safe would you be if you were close to someone? If something was delivered to your house, did you have to wash it down? And if you imagine that kind of scenario, but we're not talking about an illness that is a disease that's going to kill around 1 or 2% of the population. It's going to kill 50% of the population. I wondered, and I continue to wonder about how well we would be able to cope. And in some strange ways, I think the medieval world was almost better prepared to cope with this level of catastrophe in comparison to us today.
Yes, I think you have to largely, certainly in the West, remove, for the most part, the religious element. We live in a secular world for many of us now, and I guess that was such an important, it's obvious, but it's important factor in the medieval period, which we wouldn't have now. So with 50% fatality rates and symptoms such as that, it doesn't bear thinking about the impact it would have on humanity now.
Yeah, well, let's hope that's just a thought experiment and not a reality.
Yeah. Yes. Well, we should think of cheerier. I guess that although the disease does return, and it does obviously kill, presumably the body is able to build up, a kind of immunity to it.
So that's actually a pretty debated issue. There are some scientists who argue that humans can gain a limited degree of immunity once they've recovered from an infection by plague. And there are some individuals that we know, actually one of them is a physician, someone who served a pope as a doctor, a guy called Guy de Chauliac, who writes about the fact that he caught plague and was very, very ill for 6 weeks, but ultimately recovered. And he went on to write the great handbook of surgery in the Middle Ages. But at a scientific level, there's two ways of coming at it. So, I think what's really important is this is evolving, and our view of it may change. It may be that a degree of immunity was possible to acquire, and the evidence suggests that when plague returned in the 1360s, a lot of the people who died were children who'd not already been exposed to the disease, which may be indicative. Perhaps just as importantly, it's also been argued that at a genetic level, people who had a particular gene known as ERAP2 were more likely to be able to fight off and survive a plague infection. And that it's been suggested that this is almost an evolutionary event in world history and in medieval history, because the population suddenly had a higher proportion of people surviving with ERAP2 after the first outbreak of the Black Death. And that's stayed within, certainly in European populations. And while it might help you with plague, it's actually not so helpful when it comes to autoimmune diseases like pneumatic rheumatism and things like rheumatoid arthritis. So that suggests that perhaps the human race has sort of self-selected itself to be able to endure subsequent outbreaks. But to come back to your wider point about how we should view the Black Death and whether we should view it just as a catalogue of horror and just as something that should be a sort of an apposite warning from history, but has nothing else to tell us. Actually, in a way that I did not expect, I came away from this project much more optimistic about us as a species in general, regardless of our failings and our weaknesses in the modern era, because I was utterly stunned and amazed by the degree of resilience that medieval humanity demonstrated, both during the first outbreak and subsequent waves of plague. And it left me with a sense that if humanity can survive this and can retain its sense of compassion and community, that I came away with the feeling that if we can survive that, we can pretty much survive anything. This view, I came away thinking humanity is going to make it through this century and hopefully many centuries to come.
Well, Thomas, I'm glad we've managed to pull it back to slightly more positive ending for us, really. This has been absolutely fascinating. And the book is out now, has been for only a few weeks, I think. And so listeners, as usual, there are links in the show notes. I really do encourage you to really buy this book. It's an extraordinary piece of work. And Thomas, thank you so much for giving me your time.
No, it's been absolutely my pleasure. Thanks very much for having me on.
We've come to the end of this club meeting, so thank you for listening. If you want to get in touch about club benefits, please do, either by email or on X or Instagram. Links are in the show notes. I've also included my Substack link so members can read articles I've written on various matters that may be of interest. The History Book Club is written and presented by me, Oliver Webb-Carter. Music is by listener Chat DMZ. Episodes continue next week and every week, so please do join, subscribe, and if you can provide the club with a 5-star rating, we would be delighted. In the meantime, I thank you again, and now I have to usher members out into the real world. Until next time.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Selling your car should feel like one less thing on your list, not one more. With Carvana, it is. Just go to Carvana.com, enter your license plate or VIN, and get a real offer down to the penny. No back and forth, no surprises, just an experience you can trust. Like your offer? Accept it. Schedule pickup, and we'll come to you with a check in hand. Your car, your timeline, your terms. Visit Carvana.com to sell your car today.
Carvana.
Pickup fees may apply.
Are you one of those media strategy people clicking through slides, scrolling spreadsheets? Yes? Good. This is for you. Because on Spotify, there's an audience that's different, locked in, loyal, invested. They're called fans. Fans don't just listen to music, they feel seen by it, like it belongs to them. So when your brand shows up on Spotify, that's who you're talking to. And you're right next to artists like me, Lizzo. So, are you ready to talk to fans? Spotify advertising. You're among fans.